Well, good morning everybody on this beautiful spring day in one of my favourite local woodlands. You might be able to see in the background, but we've got carpets of wild garlic and I'm really looking forward to photographing it and bringing you guys along. And there's something that I want to talk about in today's video, which is just all around embracing seasonality in photos. And it's something that's taken me a number of years to realise and fully understand. So when I say embrace seasonality in your images, what do I mean by that? Well, I think, like most photographers, when I started my journey as a photographer, I spent a lot of time trying to develop my visual style. And that's not necessarily the subject matter or the genre of photography that I was pursuing, whether that's landscape or street photography. It's more of the kind of aesthetic or the editing style that I was favouring for my images. I think that's always something that's very important to develop because it's like your own unique fingerprint on your work, and it can take years to develop something that feels right for you, and it's fine if that changes over time. It certainly did for me. But for a number of years I always favoured kind of moodier edits, I suppose. Everything was a lot darker. I would desaturate vibrant colours like green, and that just meant that there were certain times of year that were better than others when it came to going out and doing photography. I used to love photographing in autumn and winter, but then in spring and summer I really struggled. I still went out with my camera because I love photography. I'm so passionate about getting outdoors with my camera. But during spring and summer, I would be desaturating all of the, I guess, seasonal elements or the elements within those photos that really gave them their beauty. And that meant that I was coming back with results that I wasn't 100% happy with. And yes, I still made some photos that I enjoyed, but the success rate was a lot worse, I suppose. So I decided to kind of change my approach when it came to visual style and aesthetic, and it's something that I want to share with you because this might be something that is worth considering if you are still currently developing your visual style or you're just looking to change things up a little bit. So really, when it comes to thinking about your editing, I've started to think less about colour and I've started to think more about tones in terms of like manipulating the tone curve and thinking more about contrast. Now, the reason that I decided to go down this route is especially now that I'm doing a lot of commercial work where I'm having to photograph at times of year that are wildly different to one another in conditions that are wildly different, one shoot to the next. So needing to be agile but still maintain some semblance of like consistent aesthetic, it just meant that I needed to find ways to create that consistency when the, I guess, subject of my images were so varied. So let's take today for example. If I'm photographing all this wild garlic, the things that I think about are what are the kind of key things about this season or this particular subject that are worth emphasizing. Now for me, wild garlic makes me think of freshness. It's that very sort of verdant green and the really nice pops of white, and it's just that kind of bright and airy feeling that sort of spring gives you. So if I was trying to adopt a moody edit on this of making everything darker and desaturating the green, I'm pulling myself further away from what this season actually provides. But what I can do is I can leave the colours the same. I can keep the greens green and I can maybe mess around with like the hue of them slightly, and I can mess around with some split toning and maybe a little bit of kind of white balance. But for the most part, I'm keeping the colours as true to what I see as possible. And then I'm manipulating the contrast. So I'm going into Lightroom and I'm looking at the tone curve and I'm adjusting where the bright parts of the image are and where the darker parts are. And what that enables me to do is it enables me to go out and shoot different subjects at different times of year, during different times of day. But because I'm thinking about contrast, I can create that seamless consistency from image to image. So that might be something that's worth experimenting with, because I think when a lot of people think about editing, they just think about, color grading, and they think about color and desaturation and changing the hues of things. And that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to pursue. But if you want to try and get consistent enjoyment in photography on any given day, then thinking a bit more about tonality might be a good way to go. I'll show you a bit more about this when we get back to the office in Lightroom, and I'll give you some examples so you can understand exactly what I'm trying to explain. Because I don't know if I'm doing a great job of explaining this, but bear with me. So it's been a really nice morning. We're coming into the middle of the day now, so the light isn't necessarily the best, but I've come here on a Friday. It's just been a day where I've had a few hours spare, so it's by no means the optimal time that I would have preferred to visit a location like this. But you know what you get, and it's nice to just adapt and make the most of whatever conditions or whatever light presents itself. But yeah, it's just a really nice location. There are bluebells here that I've photographed in the past. It's a bit further up the trail, so we're probably not going to make it there today. And we've also got this river that sort of runs through the woods as well, so it's just somewhere that I like to revisit. And on that point of bluebells, I've also been kind of pondering something else as I've been wandering around today. I think I prefer photographing wild garlic to photographing bluebells. It's a hot take, and I'd be keen to know your thoughts in the comments. But bluebells are obviously really beautiful, and getting those carpets of bluebells here in the native and ancient woodlands in the UK is just always something that is lovely to see. It's a real marker for the start of spring, which is just something that I find just, I guess, very motivating in terms of just getting out with the camera more. But I think from an aesthetic point of view, wild garlic just seems to have a quality to it. I don't know if it's just the white and green contrast. It just feels so fresh and so vibrant that for me, I just think it's a nicer subject to photograph. But all this is subjective, of course. I'm just sharing my thoughts with you all. But I'd be interested to see if you have a favourite. So I'm back home at my computer, and I thought I'd take this opportunity to dive into Lightroom and give you some editing tips on how you can approach this aesthetic in a more tonal way, as opposed to just thinking purely about colour when it comes to creating your edits. So this particular shot is of a place called Kemlyn Bay on Anglesey, somewhere that I went last month, and it's just a nice seascape shot, but there's a lot that we can do with this file. As you can see, the raw file here is pretty flat. Exposure wise, it's quite nice. We've got this nice sort of triangle where the highlights, the shadows aren't clipped, and most of the information is in the midtones, which is absolutely fine. This was a really stormy, overcast day, as you can see by the sky. So really it was just about, I guess, emphasizing that mood, but thinking about the tones within the image and how best to accentuate those. So let me kind of walk you through my approach when it comes to, I guess, doing the post-production on an image like this. So let's start just by fixing the exposure a little bit. Just want to make it a little bit brighter so we can start to see what we're working with a bit more in terms of the colours within this scene. Obviously, the nice bluey teals of the water and the contrast between the kind of orangey yellow lichens on the rocks was the thing that drew me to this scene initially, just because it's a nice colour contrast, the lichens are a nice point of interest, and you have this kind of like crashing wave in the middle, and these kind of channels all kind of like lead nicely as a triangle sort of pointing to the middle of the image. So compositionally, that's what I was working with. But really, we need to think about the edit and how to get the most out of this file. So what I like to do is start just by raising your exposure to a place where you're kind of roughly happy with how bright the image is. And we can adjust this a little bit as we go through. So let's just leave it there for now. Next, what I like to do is just reduce the contrast a little bit. What I'm enjoying in my edits at the moment is a bit more of a kind of flatter profile. I don't really want any harsh contrast I want the lighter parts of the image to be quite soft, and I want the dark parts to also be a little bit soft. So there's no real sort of like true black, and there's no true white, I suppose. Everything is just a little bit more muted. So how I approach this is just by first reducing the contrast by about 10. Then I like to just reduce the highlights. So you can see here, like in the waves, especially this wave sort of in the background, you know, reducing those highlights just initially adds a little bit of softness to those brightest parts of the image. I also like to just bring up the shadows a little bit just to make sure that we're not losing any detail in some of these darker rocks. All I'm doing here is I'm just setting up a good blank canvas to then fine-tune the tonality at a later point. I also like to increase the whites just a little bit and reduce the blacks a little bit. Again, it's just adding a nice kind of blend of even contrast without any of the bright and dark parts of the image being, I guess, too dramatic at this point. We're going to look at colour in a little bit, but just as we're on this first panel here, I do also like to increase the vibrance by maybe, I don't know, 16 or so, but I like to reduce the saturation by about 10. So what that means is that vibrance is increasing the saturation in a more focused way. It's looking at the most present or most saturated parts of the image, and it's only saturating those areas. It's not global saturation. That's what the saturation slider below does. And I like to reduce the overall saturation because I want to be a little bit more specific as to what colors I'm going to choose to emphasize, and I'll be doing that in the HSL tab. So moving down to the tone curve, this is where most of the work kind of takes place for me. So you'll probably see a lot of people having varying different approaches of how they like to use a tone curve. If you haven't used a tone curve before, this is a way for you to add contrast and manipulate contrast in your image using specific points within the curve, and you can also manipulate color in the same way using the RGB channels of the tone curve to push certain hues in certain different directions. We're not going to look at that today. I'm just looking at the contrast using the general global tone curve. So you might have heard of an S-curve. That's a kind of common one that people use. That's where you're literally going to put 3 points. You're going to take the sort of upper mid-tones and the highs, and you're going to push them up, and then you're going to get the darker tones, you're going to push those down, and that creates this kind of S shape. But as you can see, that just makes everything really contrasty, and that's what I want to try and avoid. So we're going to manipulate this a little bit. What I like to do is I like to take this basis of the S curve with these sort of 5 points, and what I'll do is I'll just add normally another point in between the mid-tones and the sort of upper or lower highlights. So it's more sort of highlight heavy in terms of where most of the manipulation is on the curve that I use. So what I like to do is I start just by dropping the darker areas slightly. Just adds a little bit of contrast into the darker regions of the image, but I like to grab this true black point and I like to lift that up a little bit. So all that does is it just makes sure that the blacks aren't true black. They're more grey, they're a bit more muted. It's a little bit more kind of filmic, I suppose. If you've ever looked at sort of film photography, it's a characteristic of a lot of images shot on film, is you just have that nice sort of softness. Now the midpoint, I tend to leave that where it is. Don't sort of touch that too much. I just use that as an anchor. But then what I like to do is rather than pushing up these sort of mid-tones and highlights to create that S-curve, I actually like to go the other way, and I actually like to reduce these points slightly. So you can see by doing that, you're just kind of softening the more contrasty parts of the image. And then this true white at the top, or like the brightest highlight, I just reduce that and I pull that down. You can definitely see in the wave up here that by reducing that, you're just really kind of softening all of that. So if I turn the tone curve sort of off and on, so that's off, that's on, just makes everything a little bit softer and a little bit darker. Now what we can do is we can fine tune this further. So let's look at some of the colours. and I'll show you how I sort of approach this. So as I mentioned, that tonality and the tone curve and the contrast is the common thread, and it's the fingerprint that I like to put on all of my images because it creates a very consistent base. And then I can just look at the merits of each image, and I can then replicate the tonality, but I can treat each image individually in terms of what I want to emphasize. So with this one, I might want to push up some of the blues. I might want to take these yellows because they're looking a little bit green at the moment. So I might just want to push those a little bit more towards orange and yellow and increase that slightly. Greens, I'm going to push those a little bit more towards blue. Increase that saturation. Same with the teals, you can see all of this water kind of on the horizon line. All of that, I don't want it to be grey, I want it to be more teal because that's sort of how it looked to my eye. I'll push that a little bit towards blue as well and just increase the luminance a little bit just to sort of draw a bit more attention to that. And then we've got the sky where I'm going to add some more local contrast because there's a lot of drama in this sky that I want to emphasize. Easiest way to do that is to grab a mask. I'm just going to do a linear gradient. I'm going to pull that down. So I want this to be a fairly smooth transition. I'm just going to drop the exposure, add a little bit of contrast in just because I want to bring out that cloud texture, maybe decrease the shadows and the blacks. And then using the color, I'm just going to make that a little bit cooler as well. But just desaturate it ever so slightly. So turning that off and on, you can see just adds some of that nice drama. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this image, which was our recently edited photo, and then I'm going to take this new photo. Let's choose this one actually, might be a bit nicer. Reset it. So completely different conditions, different subject matter. This is just a nice kind of environmental shot on a walk. And if we just copy those curves, you can see what we're doing now is we're creating a consistent editing style, and the colors are things that we can look at individually. So, you know, I can look at the grass and I can think, okay, well, that's a little bit yellow, so I can make it a bit more green, maybe desaturate it a little bit. Maybe I don't want as much blue in the sky, so I can just tone that down a little bit. And let's just say we want to increase some of the oranges and some of these kind of fields. But what we're doing there is we're creating that consistent aesthetic because the tonality and the contrast of these two images is very similar. So when you kind of look at them side by side, you could think that they are created by the same photographer. And that's the kind of thing that I'm looking to develop further, is just an editing style and a fingerprint that feels right for me. So there we have it. Just a quick look at my new approach to editing. I hope you found it helpful. I just think it's important to experiment with the tone curve and with contrast and not be too fixated on color grading. Of course, there are ways that we can color grade this, and I probably will do some color grading. But that's a whole other video and a whole other rabbit hole to go down. But just from a basic editing standpoint, yeah, contrast is your friend. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Sorry I haven't shared a lot of photos actually from the photography outing that I went on today, but this broader topic I think is something that's quite valuable for all photographers to at least have a play around with and at least consider for your own work. So if you found it helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more content of this type. Thanks as always for watching, always appreciate your support, and I will see you all next Wednesday for another video.